Do you think you're the only thing controlling the parachute? Think again. We'll be discussing those environmental factors that can dramatically change your parachute's performance.
We're going to go over how elevation, temperature, humidity, and certain weather events affect our parachute flight. Let's begin with elevation. So I want you to take a moment to think about when elevation increases, what happens to air density. So for example, if I'm going from my home drop zone in Florida out west, let's say Mile High in Colorado, what's going to happen to the air density? Hopefully, you're going to see that as elevation increases, the air pressure is going to decrease. So, higher elevations have lower air pressure and also lower air density. What about temperature? When it's getting hotter, what happens to air density then? And if you remember, back to the saying that hot air rises and cold air sinks, well, that all has to do with differences in their density. So, cold air molecules are not moving quite as quickly. Hot air molecules have more energy, so they are moving more and there's more space in between them. So, cold air is denser air and hot air is not as dense. Now, what about humidity? So, when the humidity increases, what's going to happen to the air density then? If you're like most people, you're probably going to say that it feels stickier outside as the humidity increases, so therefore that must mean that the air density is getting higher as well. Turns out that's not the case, and let's go through why that is. So you need to think back to your academic days when you learned about the ideal gas law. So the ideal gas law essentially states that if you've got a certain volume and you get a certain number of molecules in that. For example, if we're just thinking about the room that you're sitting in, that room only gets a certain number of molecules in it. So anything that you're going to put in molecule-wise, you're going to have to kick something out. When we think about air, it's made up of mostly nitrogen and oxygen. So as we increase humidity, we're going to be adding in water vapor molecules. So for every water vapor molecule that we put in, we either have to kick out nitrogen or a molecule of oxygen. When we look at the molecular weights, we see that nitrogen is 28 grams, oxygen is 32 grams, while water, H2O, is only 18 grams. So for every water vapor molecule that is going in there, it is kicking out the heavier molecule of either nitrogen or oxygen. So this means that overall, that humid air, it may feel super sticky, like you're walking through soup, I've heard people say before, but in reality, it turns out that the air density is decreasing as humidity is increasing. So now we have the concept of density altitude. Density altitude is going to be a way that we can combine the effects of elevation, temperature, and humidity into a single useful number. It's going to be the pressure altitude corrected for the non-standard temperature and humidity. So put another way, this is the apparent or even feels like altitude for the parachute. So there are all sorts of calculators that you can use online to calculate density altitude. What are the numbers that you're going to need? If you go to your weather forecast, you can find the temperature, the pressure, as well as the dew point. You're going to take these numbers. You can go to your favorite density altitude calculator and plug those in, tell it to calculate, and it tells you what the density altitude would be in feet. Skydive Palaca, our actual altitude or elevation is less than 50 feet. However, on this day, with this weather conditions, you can see that the density altitude, or again, that feels like altitude for the parachute, is over 1900 feet. So density altitude actually changes, and it can change over the day. So here I put in some numbers on May 3rd at 8, noon, and 5 p.m. So we can see that in the morning it was less than 1,000 feet. But of course, as the day gets hotter and it was a little bit humid as well, then the density altitude increases and then it starts to decrease again in the afternoon. So density altitude changed over the day, but it can also change over the year. So I just randomly chose the middle of a month to see what's going to happen to density altitude. So in Florida, in winter, our months are colder as well as drier. And then in middle of summer, which is the July number that you see, it's going to be very hot and humid. So we can see that the density altitude has changed dramatically. Again, density altitude, that is the altitude that your parachute feels like it's at. So why is that important? Because a higher density altitude, right, as the number is increasing, is actually meaning less air density. So there's less air molecules for your parachute. So that's going to mean that your openings are going to be harder or quicker. Your descent rate is going to be faster. Your airspeed actually increases about 1 to 2% for every 1,000 feet of elevation gained. And you also have less flare power because your parachute just doesn't have as many air molecules to push down on when you're flaring. And that decreases about 4% for every 1,000 feet. So in the previous slide, when we saw that our density altitude was ranging anywhere from below 1,000 feet up to over 3,000 feet during the year, that means that my airspeed has now changed 6 to 7% faster in the summer, and that my flare power is more than 10% weaker in the summer with the hotter temperatures. So now let's switch to thinking about the weather. So I'm going to cover really quickly thunderstorms, dust devils, and then spend some more time with turbulence. Thunderstorms, there's updrafts that create them, and then you can get downdrafts coming out of them. So wind speed and direction can change dramatically when you've got thunderstorms, just even in the area. It doesn't have to be coming right at you. If they're pop-up showers, maybe here and there, that can also dramatically change wind speed as well as direction. Downdrafts in the middle of a storm, sometimes those winds can be over 100 miles an hour. And then, of course, there's also the risk of lightning whenever you've got thunderstorms around. Dust devils. This is created by very strong surface heating. So typically happens on days that have clear skies and really light winds. I didn't know this until I actually started looking into it for this video, actually. But the average diameter of a dust devil can range from 10 to 300 feet. So they can be huge or tiny. And the height is typically 500 to 1,000 feet is how tall they are. They generally have weaker winds, but some of them can be up to 2 miles an hour. And the real danger with dust devils is that they can be virtually invisible unless they're actually picking up debris. Otherwise, you don't even see them. So even in Florida, if we've got a hot, dry day, which we actually did this past, I believe it was in April, we actually had some dust devils that went through our landing area. Surprising, because we're usually not that hot and dry. What about turbulence? Well, turbulence is the violent or unsteady movement of any fluid, and this actually includes air. Air is a fluid. The four main causes of turbulence is going to be mechanical, thermal, frontal, as well as wind shear. So what are each of these? Mechanical turbulence is what we usually think about, right? This is when we hear that turbulence can occur 10 to 20 times the height of the obstacle on its downwind side. I really like this graphic because it shows in orange, right, all that turbulent air, but it also shows that as the wind is flowing over the object, there's a little bit of turbulence on top of that object, and there's a little bit on the upwind side as well. But the majority of the turbulence that you're going to find here is on the downwind side. So 10 to 20 times the height of the obstacle, and those numbers are going to be on the higher end as your wind speed increases. We can also find rotor wash, jet blast, or wake turbulence from aircraft that might be in the area. So if you are landing near a taxiway or a runway and there's aircraft going by, or you've got helicopters flying around, you need to be aware of where you might find turbulence coming off of those. Also be turbulence that happens behind other parachutes as well. So I found this video on YouTube, and it's going to show what happens when a person flies too closely behind another. Just watch the ripple that's going to go through this parachute in the back. So when you're up higher, not a big deal. Your parachute has time to inflate and go back to how it was originally flying. But if you're in a landing pattern, for example, you would really want to avoid flying about 45 degrees above behind that person in front of you. Now, moving on to thermal or convective turbulence. So, this is going to happen whenever you've got uneven surface heating, and that happens whenever there's two different colors or textures meet. Here's a photo of the airport, and you can see that that is going to happen pretty much everywhere. You've got asphalt next to grass, so asphalt is going to be radiating heat at a different rate than the grass would be. So, right next to each other, you've got two different columns of air that are moving at different speeds, and that's going to cause this thermal or convective turbulence. Frontal turbulence you can find with any front that's coming in, although it's more prevalent with cold fronts, especially ones that are faster moving. So you've got the warm air that's being pushed up and over this cold front that's coming in, and that creates turbulence along the frontal boundary. And finally, we've got wind shear. So the two different causes of wind shear on the left, you can see in this graphic, wind shear is being caused when you've got directional differences. So as we're going vertically up through the different altitudes, the wind is coming from different directions. That can cause some turbulence. Or it could also be as you're going up in different altitudes, if there's differences, big differences between the speed that the air is moving. If you've got two that are next to each other at really different speeds, that can also cause turbulence too. So overall, we've got to be really careful with turbulence because it's also invisible, but it can have big impacts. So again, here is another video off of YouTube. Not even sure what drop zone this is from. If you happen to know, leave me a comment. I'd like to know. And we're not sure what exactly causes this turbulence. It's not clear in the video, but we can definitely see the effects of it. So, if we do encounter turbulence, what should we do? First of all, we want to fly in full flight as much as possible. If we expect turbulence to be in the area, or if we've already experienced some bumpiness, we'd like to be in full flight. If you're in the middle of your landing pattern, you've got to do turns, go ahead and do turns, but stay in full flight as much as possible. If this happens closer to the ground and it causes your parachute to suddenly dive, turn, or drop, then you should think about keeping the following in mind. Number one, you want to stop or reduce any sudden loss of altitude. Give whatever input you need to your wing to try to keep it level. Keep trying to go for a clear, open landing area. And definitely, as you saw in that last video, be prepared for a really hard landing. So think about getting your feet and knees together so that you can PLF. In summary, what have we talked about? Number one, increasing elevation means that we are going to be decreasing our air density. Also, heat and humidity will also decrease our air density. And when we've decreased our air density, this actually increases our airspeed as well as decreasing our flare power. There's just not enough air molecules around. Thunderstorms can cause wind speed and direction to change dramatically. Dust devils appear on those hot, dry days, and you may not even be able to see them. Turbulence, you're really not going to be able to see. You just feel the effects or see the effects that it has on other people's parachutes. But as we covered, there are several different causes of turbulence, and you just need to be prepared in case it happens closer to the ground to have a hard landing. Practically speaking, what does this mean for skydivers? Well, perhaps you're going to be traveling to another DZ. And if you're going from a lower elevation to a higher elevation, or maybe even you're going from a colder climate to a hotter one, you're going to want to be extra cautious. You need to expect increased speed and decreased flare power out of your parachute. And you may even want to consider jumping something larger for at least a few jumps. Also, whenever you're jumping in a new ZZ, find out what weather patterns you need to be concerned about. Is this an area that is known to have dust devil activity? So you're not going to be jumping in the middle of the day when it gets hot. Is this an area where thunderstorms are prevalent, like here in Florida? Or even here in Florida, we have sea breezes. So a lot of times you'll have the winds coming from the east, and then at some point they switch 180 degrees as the western sea breeze takes over, or vice versa. So just find out what are the things that you need to know about at that DZ. And finally, downsizing. Right? If you're considering downsizing, you may not want to do this in the wintertime. If you're currently comfortable, or maybe your parachute is feeling just a little bit sluggish in the winter, think about how it's going to fly, what its performance is going to be like in the middle of summer.
Understanding the role the environment plays on your parachute flight is just one way that you can become a more knowledgeable skydiver. So if you haven't already, please consider liking this video as well as subscribing to our channel so that you don't miss out on any future content.